You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders. From ship to shore, air to ground, cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
November 7th, 1916 was a beautiful day for most of the country as it began to elect a president. "That does it," said the Republican Party national chairman. "This is Republican weather. It is all over but the shouting." It was a joke, but it sort of reflected the thinking of the Republican Party on that day. One voter who begged to differ, Democratic President Woodrow Wilson, was driven in his automobile through that Republican sunshine from his house, Shadow Lawn, in Elberon, New Jersey, impressive home near the Jersey coast, and drove out to Princeton University, where he cast his vote. "Students cheer Wilson," read the headline of area newspapers. Students called to the President of the United States for a speech. They didn't get one. Wilson just waved, and then drove back home. Said a newspaper, 16 men, 3 automobiles, 4 hours, and 54 gallons of gasoline were required for the president to vote for himself. Bearded nominee Charles Evans Hughes, the former Supreme Court Justice, now Republican presidential candidate, wasn't terribly far away from where Wilson was at the Astor Hotel in New York City. Voting at 7:30 in the morning. He cast vote number 13. Well, that was said to be Woodrow Wilson's lucky number. Yeah. It's a little weird, but after all, he was the 13th president of Princeton University. "It never brought me bad fortune," Wilson would say to people. In any case, Hughes sought to reverse that 13 symbolically and make it bad luck. And many people on this election day were telling Hughes he succeeded with just that. He'd win back those states that Wilson had won in 1912 when the Republicans were split. That's all he had to do, and he'd beat Wilson. "We can beat Hughes or Wilson," so said a newspaper ad from Office Outfitters of Birmingham, Alabama. "When it comes to delivering the goods, if they are used in the office, try us when you want to service stationery and furniture." Office Outfitters, 2019, 3rd Ave, Birmingham, Alabama. Alabama was going to go for Woodrow Wilson. But New York, and its huge amount of electoral votes, was a state that would be key in the election. Wilson won it because Taft and Roosevelt were split. It was pretty exciting to be in a swing state. You couldn't get a table in New York's Times Square. The nightbirds filled up all the restaurants watching the results. There were no TVs, obviously, but it wasn't without visual stimuli, no, far from it. In American cities, people flocked to the local newspaper office. Any newspaper office. And in New York, there were many impromptu bulletin boards and movie theaters that were showing the latest election results that they were getting. They'd update them as soon as they can with placards or chalk. The searchlight on top of the Times building was ablaze as bulletin boards were placed with those latest results, replaced physically with the latest returns all by hand in front of the Time offices on the sidewalk. They didn't yet have that neat pneumatic scrolling display that they'd get in the 1920s. There was a lot of zip. The New York American newspaper installed 50 telephone lines to get the word out to theaters. Yes, 350 moving picture theaters throughout the city providing results of the election, along with hotels and just corner bulletin boards all across the city where people at different sidewalks were gathering to find out what's going on, who's the next president. Even more modern, at DeForest Labs in the upper part of the city, a man using a new vacuum tube powered transmitter that you would now call a radio telephone gave out the signal of his own voice. And if you were an operator, that is to say a person with a receiving unit, you could hear him. And there were 7,000 of these so-called wireless telephone operators within a 200-mile radius. And while giving periodic updates, this operator, not yet known as a disc jockey, played all the hits of the time. The Star-Spangled Banner, Dixie, and Columbia, the gem of the ocean. In between them, he would give the results that he had through this new fantastic medium from the electrical experimenter of that time. The radio phone equipment consists of 2 large oscillon tubes used as the generators of the high-frequency current. They develop 1/2 kilowatt of energy, and this charges the antenna. The high current is controlled by suitable rheostat, and a picture of Mr. Scheer in front of this big contraption cables, electric dials, and lights, and a turntable, with his mouth to the microphone, is featured in the electrical experimenter. And Mr. Scheer has something to say earlier than people thought, and that is that Wilson's going to lose New York, and Hughes is going to carry New York State by 100,000 votes. Hughes wins New York. The Times will shout from its building in its relay network. It's not a shock, because Hughes was the former governor of New York, but some people thought it would be close. There's a bunch of other politics that go his way. And New York is so big that at least 2 newspapers would print too early. Hughes is president. Even more newspapers would hint at it as the night goes on. They'd say things like, Republicans confident, or appears Hughes has votes. A few might carry a cautionary note. Announcement will be made when the West comes in. To be clear, Charles Evans Hughes does not wait for the Democrats to concede. The newspapers can take it back. That's what he tells his aides before he goes to bed. Yet everyone around him thought he was the new president, and Woody was a goner. As more states come in, it gets clearer. I mean, who loses New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Iowa, and New England? Even the VP's home state, Indiana, is coming in for Hughes. New Jersey was the president's home state. Now, his home state is Virginia, which he's going to win as a Democrat at this time in the solid South, as they called it. He'll win that. That's expected. But New Jersey was Wilson's political identity, where he lived most of his adult life. State people associated with him as a celebrity university president. You know, the president of Princeton University at this time, this is one of the reasons that Woodrow Wilson becomes a candidate for president. He goes around the whole country as the team plays football and makes speeches. He's kind of a national figure. But here, he's losing his home state. Now, there's many reasons for that. I mean, one of it is that the machine never really liked Wilson that much. That could be a whole podcast. But in any case, all of this bad news is happening for Wilson. You can forgive the newspapers. Perhaps it's not so terrible that the El Paso Times has a big picture of Hughes and his VP candidate Fairbanks and says, Los futuros presidente y vicepresidente de los Estados Unidos. The future president and vice president of the United States. That news may have been just fine with the man in the White House. When his aide, Joe Tumulty, called him on election night, he's in a nearby town in Asbury Park, and Wilson's at his house in Elborough. Wilson said, Joe, I believe we've been licked. Tumulty resists. No, stay where you are, Mr. President. Don't make any statements. Wilson agrees. He won't say anything. Tumulty has been Wilson's aide, and a very solid one, since his time as New Jersey governor. Tumulty comes from an Irish-American family, rough and tumble, Jersey City politics. Father was a grocer. There are many political meetings, even when he was a kid, that he listened to and got involved early in politics. He's good at it. You know, it's hard to know what anyone in history thinks at any time. Probably at some times Wilson really wanted to win this. But there's other statements he made that suggest he didn't care. This was a man in a stressful office with, at minimum, a nervous condition who just got married. That's insider stuff. Who knows what he's thinking? What he says publicly, Wilson receives news cheerfully. As continued discouraging news came to the executive offices, disappointment was generally expressed, but the president remained cheerful. He filled the time between receiving returns by talking with Mrs. Wilson, Mrs. Margaret Wilson, that's Wilson's daughter, and other relatives. No effort was made to conceal the fact that the outlook was not bright. Wilson at his summer home, what they call Shadow Lawn. There's a reconstructed building there. The actual building burnt down, the house. It's part of Monmouth College now, down on what I would describe as the Jersey Shore on the coast. And Tumulty is over in Asbury Park, not far away at this time, and now a kind of beach town. The offices that Tumulty is in happen to still be there. It's the old Asbury Electric Company, and that's where they got the telegraph machine and everything where you can get the news. The paper goes on. Out in the seclusion of Shadow Lawn, the president was amid quiet, but the executive offices were surrounded by an excited crowd. It is, after all, next to a newspaper, the Asbury Park Press, and people are there getting news. It's flashing headlines. Pictures of the president and Mr. Hughes were both received with applause by different crowds. Connecticut gives Hughes electoral vote. Wilson seems to lead in Wyoming. Your hair is your charm. Don't stay gray. Sage tea keeps your hair dark when mixed with sulfur. It brings back its beautiful luster at once. Gray hair, however handsome, denotes advancing age. We all know the advantages of a youthful appearance. Sage tea. That's the ad in the newspaper. Hughes takes to bed early, and he's not to be disturbed. Before he does, aides tell him he is the president-elect. And here's the funny thing. We talked about how Wilson was reluctant, and maybe doesn't want to even win this election. But Hughes had been at first reluctant. He wrote in notes he'd written for an autobiography, the idea of a justice of the Supreme Court taking part in politics was abhorrent to me. I strongly opposed the use of my name and the selection or instructions of any delegates. But there was an insistent and growing demand for my nomination. It was thought I was the only one who could unite the factions of the Republican Party and restore it to the place that it had been. A sign of the stakes for the election and how high these stakes were is seen in Berkeley, California. A freak election bet in Berkeley shows a college town odds of 200 pounds on Wilson and 149 pounds on Hughes. Pounds? Well, this is what they mean. Louis Pushard, who conducts a grocery store at California and Addison Streets and who weighs 200 pounds, has agreed, if Hughes is elected, to wheel J.F. Torrey, a 140-pound vegetable dealer, in a wheelbarrow through the business section of Berkeley, California. If Wilson is elected, the 146-pound Torrey will trundle the 200-pound Pushard over the same route. Reading the papers on the night of Election Day, there's a sense that the grocer is going to have to wheel the vegetable dealer. That Hughes has this. Wilson still can win, some people acknowledge, but it's like everything here on out, you'd have to completely win the table. So out of formality, newspapers are waiting. No one has heard from these voting Californians, and that would annoy Californians who were quite active the day before. As California, this state in 1916, already allowed women to vote. Here from the San Francisco Bulletin. In California, women are having the last word of the presidential political campaign in San Francisco this afternoon. In the Women's National Suffrage Association meeting, the finishing touches on the strenuous drive were put. Women have waged a campaign in this city for the re-election of Woodrow Wilson. But yet, Hughes leading at Wilson's summer home, reads a report. Long Branch, New Jersey. With practically complete returns from Monmouth County, Hughes is winning the county where Wilson's summer home is situated. Not only that, Wilson is defeated in Democratic National Committee Chair McCormick's home ward, the first ward of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Well, with the news, pretty clear that he's going to lose New York. He's going to lose VP Marshall's home state of Indiana. Wilson goes to bed. If there is definitive news, please wake me up, he tells Tumulty. His man Tumulty knows what that means. Don't wake Wilson up. It's the same with Charles Evans Hughes. Reporters try to call him and are told, the president can't talk right now. The first crack in the armor that something odd is happening is Ohio. Ohio is always Republican, but not the way the vote is coming in. There's a Democratic gubernatorial candidate, James Cox, looking pretty swell for his election, and strong Wilson vote is coming in as well. New Hampshire, solid Republican New England state, is a tougher fight for the GOP than expected, but New Hampshire GOP still insists they've got this state. Georgia is all right for Wilson, says the Brooklyn Citizen newspaper. That's no surprise. We know coming in that Wilson will have the so-called solid South, as any Democrat at this time would. This is because they're not really fair elections. We know that large number of citizens, particularly African-American citizens at this time, are just not able to vote. Some are, but it's more than that. When we say the solid South or the South goes for Democrats in the times we're talking about, it's also machine politics of a sort. It may not be a big city machine, and he's going to get a 50-1 vote in South Carolina, Wilson is. So Georgia, South Carolina, these states are not surprising. Democrats win the solid South all the time and lose these presidential elections since the Civil War, so it's not really a huge deal. Joe Tumulty, the president's right-hand man, he can't let the psychological momentum go down. This is 1916, and I know we think about this as a modern thing, like, gosh, when are they going to count these votes? Or if we announce that we're winning, we'll have more momentum. Yeah, this is 1916, and it's completely part of the game. Tumulty knows he can't let that momentum down. He tells reporters, Wilson will win. Just wait till the western states come in. Hughes has won big states, swing states. But now, with the news from Ohio, they try to talk to Hughes, and reporters are told again, the president-elect cannot be disturbed. Next to Hughes' hotel room are instruments that have been clicking for 2 hours and a half, and a sheaf of telegrams with some good news. That Jersey repudiates Wilson, with 12 counties complete, 25 small districts missing in remaining counties. His plurality is 54,000 in Wilson's home state. Yet, one New Jerseyan in Wilson's corner is Thomas Edison. Wilson will probably win, Edison says. But it's not a sure thing, because many people in the United States do not think for themselves, and they follow others like a drove of sheep. Edison insists, I've got no quarrel with Hughes the man. He may be all right, but it's the men behind him that Edison doesn't like. We know what Wilson has done and what he will do. That's an important endorsement, but not enough to get the state where Edison's lab is located. One western state does come in because the win is so big. Utah, strong for Wilson. Well, that went for William Howard Taft in 1912. Now it's going for Wilson. More incompletes. Incomplete returns last night gave President Wilson a slight lead in Arizona. A lead for Hughes, though, seen in Wisconsin, though no county is complete, has this reckoning. The Dunton Cafeteria, 706 Commercial, Atchison, Kansas. We cut the high cost of living. Substantial meals or dainty lunches. No waiting. See your food before you buy it. Cheapest, cleanest, quickest, and the best place to eat in Atchison, Kansas. This city, Atchison, Kansas, has gone for President Wilson. And maybe, the newspaper suggests, the rest of the state has too. 10, 11 o'clock on election night. There's a little mood change. One person that notices this change is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He writes to his wife, Eleanor, "This has been the most exhilarating day of my life. It may turn out the president may win after all." Roosevelt is Wilson's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's also cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, who is supporting Hughes. But this Roosevelt, as we know, comes from the Democratic side of the family. Close states will likely be recounted, says a headline. Special agents sent to watch Minnesota polls, and California results are in lockboxes. In Lancaster, Pennsylvania, while the state is running for Hughes, it seems, a group gets news of the positive momentum for Wilson, perhaps, and form a parade. About 500 Democrats and followers of the president gathered together, says a Lancaster newspaper. A band seemed to be in readiness, as though the faithful followers were assured of the election and prepared this program. Red lights by the hundred, including torches and other means of illumination, were lighted. The crowd formed in a line of march and proceeded west on West King Street. At Manor Street, they switched off and started on a tour through the 8th Ward. The residents in this section were expecting the occurrence, and many second-story windows were raised. As people opened their windows, popped their heads out, and said, "Who won?" these men would respond, "Wilson." Then, satisfied, the windows were shut, and they returned to their beds. Wilson maintains North Dakota lead, but New Hampshire Hughes leaders refuse to quit. Full 40% of the town clerks throughout the state have rendered no official return of the vote in New Hampshire. But leaders say the figures they have verified indicate Mr. Hughes has carried New Hampshire by a comfortable plurality. We do not concede New Hampshire to the Democrats. Republicans hint at official recount demand. Hughes leads in New Mexico, around 200 votes, the newspapers blare. West Virginia, which had been conceded to Hughes in many estimates, in late returns showed that lead shrinking. Oklahoma has gone Democratic, says the Brooklyn Citizen. Democratic managers relying on women's vote in Kansas. But with that bit of news for him, more news comes in for his opponent. Michigan for Hughes. South rolls up usual majorities for Democrats. Vermont for Hughes. Kansas City, carried by Wilson, both the Kansas side and the Missouri side. When more of these Western returns come in, a reporter calls up Hughes and is told again, the president-elect is sleeping. And the reporter is annoyed, well, tell him he's not president-elect. It's a story we don't really know if it happened. Evening Capital News in Boise, Idaho says, both Republicans and Democrats claiming victory. The Republican nominee was in the lead in the race, but the swing was towards Wilson. The president's campaign managers were confidently claiming Wilson's election by 2 votes more than necessary. At the same time, the Republican manager's formal claim was 284 votes. Both parties claimed Delaware. Both parties claimed Maryland. Both parties claimed Idaho, Indiana, and West Virginia. Our man Hughes has enough. 284 electoral votes by all the states we're leading in, the RNC claims. Republican claims are ridiculous, counters Democratic Chair McCormick. We have carried Delaware and Maryland. California's in doubt, and we don't concede Indiana. Dries lay claim to Bryan's state. Omaha, Nebraska. Scattering returns of the state and incomplete returns from Omaha show the Prohibition Amendment there carried a majority. Uncle Joe Cannon, former Speaker of the House, feels very happy. In Danville, Illinois, Joe Cannon said he recently received election returns in the library of his home, and he was visibly gratified over the evident election of Hughes. Listen. Men's blue serge suits, only $10. Men's overcoats from $4 and up. Union-made hats from $1.35 and up. Specially low prices on carpenter's tool chests. Good blankets for $1. A. Riegler, 121 19th Street between M and N, Bakersfield, California. Hughes' big victory in Chicago City. Associated Press estimates Hughes' plurality in Illinois outside of Cook County at 100,000 and currently leading in Cook County by 2. This podcaster will note you are far away from the day that the 14-year-old now Richard Daley will have any influence on Chicago politics. An interesting thing for this election that we're going to talk about occurs in Chicago. Chicago records women's votes and men's votes separately. Illinois allows women to vote as a state at this time, but records the vote separately. There's about 260,000 women that vote in Cook County, and Hughes is going to have about a 5,000 majority there. To counter this bad news about Illinois, Tumulty just comes out and says, "We claim California." Nothing to base it on. The San Francisco Examiner then makes fun of these Democratic claims. When it was seen New York had been carried by Hughes, they turned their attention to Illinois. When success could not come from that direction, a claim was made for Maine and Massachusetts. Those both returned for Hughes. Now the Democrats claim Ohio, and they say, go to sleep. Pureness, goodness, sweetness, freshness is the perfect foundation of national ice cream. On top of that, we've added dainty fruit flavorings to please discriminating palates. It pays to ask for national ice cream. The Newcastle News in Delaware charges that huge sums of money have been sent to Cincinnati for use in helping the Republican ticket at the polls today were made in a statement issued from Democratic Western headquarters in Chicago today. The statement follows. Information from a source of unquestioned reliability reached our headquarters that banks in St. Louis have sent thousands of dollars in Republican money to a leading bank here in Cincinnati to be used at the polls today. School days are joy days to the boy or girl whose body is properly nourished with foods that are rich in muscle-making, brain-building elements that are easily digested. Youngsters fed on shredded wheat biscuit are full of the bounce and buoyancy that belong to youth. Ready cooked, ready to serve, made at Niagara Falls, New York. Royal Theatre tonight, last showing for Romeo and Juliet, with Harry Hillard and Theda Bara. At the Orpheum, Mary Pickford, Less Than the Dust, an appealing and picturesque story of modern India in 7 reels, the first of Mary Pickford's superior pictures by her own company. The Daily Sentinel, Colorado, aside from uncertainty, the most remarkable thing was the sudden wiping out of the Hughes majorities in the East by returns from the West. Albuquerque, New Mexico, returns from less than 1/4 of the precinct give President Wilson now a slight lead. Butte, Montana, Wilson leads with 282 out of 1,219 precincts in. Nevada, incomplete returns show a majority of 1,800 for Wilson. First Congresswoman, hyphen between Congress and woman, gets a shower of congratulations. Miss Janet Rankin of Montana, confident of election, declares she will represent women of the country in the national legislature. Somewhere around 8 in the morning, Charles Evans Hughes wakes up. After sleeping nearly 7 hours, he was reading the newspapers. Mr. Hughes adhered to his determination from last night to make no comment and issue no statement until the results were beyond doubt. When Woodrow Wilson's daughter comes in to tell him that, Dad, more of the returns are showing that you will win, Wilson apparently says, tell it to the Marines. He wasn't insulting U.S. Marines. It's an old saying relating to the British Marines. Sailors used to say that, unlike their own savvy selves, the Royal Marines would believe anything you told them. That meant Wilson didn't really believe her.
What if you could have a career where the opportunities are as vast as our nation, where it's not about mission statements, but a shared mission? At U.S. Customs and Border Protection, we go beyond to protect more than borders, from ship to shore, air to ground. Cities to local communities, CBP agents and officers are keeping people safe. Join U.S. Customs and Border Protection and go beyond for something far greater than yourself. Learn more at cbp.gov/careers.
I'm Jane Perlez, longtime foreign correspondent and former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times. I've been a foreign correspondent in lots of places: Somalia, Indonesia, Pakistan. But nowhere as important to the world as China.
I mean, China is not dropping anti-democratic paratroopers into Montana. But of course, we did see things like the weather balloon/spy balloon riveting the whole country for a week.
This is Face Off, an 8-part series in which we'll take you behind the scenes to key moments in the tumultuous U.S.-China relationship. We'll speak with a diplomat, a spy, a tech reporter, a U.S. admiral, even Yo-Yo Ma. Plus, my pal and noted China historian Rana Mitter joins the conversation. We'll look at what's driving the two nations apart and explore whether anything can help bring them back together. Face Off launches April 9th.
Not many thought that Wilson could be reelected on this night. Not everybody liked him. And if you knew Wilson, we could get you could all read the Scott Berg books and other sources and get the whole picture. I mean, if you knew Wilson, he could be funny and normal and things like that and loving and all of that. But inside perception, even in Washington, D.C. and New Jersey, he's a bit of a cold fish. And a lot of that got into the outer world as well. Wasn't like an extremely well-regarded person unless you were a partisan Democrat. So he had that against him. He got 1 million less votes than the combined total of Taft and Roosevelt, the two Republicans running in the election in 1912. To win, he was going to have to run the table here. Yet sometimes have to run the table. Maybe you do it. Wilson leads in Fresno, says the San Francisco Bulletin. Slight Hughes lead in San Diego. Nebraska is given to Wilson by 35,000. Dueling headlines. Hughes has 277 electoral votes, said the Ithaca Journal. McCormick says Wilson the winner, said the Green Bay Gazette. Over the next few days, there would be headlines like 5 states remain in doubt. Result of election remains in dispute. This one has it. The other one has it. It didn't matter when either candidate went to bed, when they sent their telegrams, when those people left the theaters or dinner tables, or if they got into a torchlight parade. Didn't matter what the chairman said, what the proto-disc jockey said on the air. It would turn out to be where most opinion was heading after midnight on election night, that Wilson would need to run the table on the western states. We're going to get into this election of 1916. Not often talked about too much. If it is talked about at all, it's in the context of World War I, and of course it belongs there. But there's more going on. And we'll see that there's a lot of things you can say about 1960. You might even say that it could compare to today in certain ways and contrast. In some ways, it's got nothing to do with today. I first did an episode about it in 2012, and it was called Why 1916 Matters. And I noted some electoral trends that up until 2012 were still unique to the 1916 election. And I'm going to talk about that later, probably in part 2. This race does feature an incumbent president. His incumbent president in a pretty weak position. And his challenger, well, not his challenger on the ballot, but at least one of his vocal Republican leaders in opposition, very outspoken man with a very large following. You can make comparisons, and we will. It's also kind of a soup of an election, 1960, with so many things happening at once that the isolation of factors can be difficult. War, socialism, the women's vote, labor, immigration, and American nationalism. President runs on a slogan that he said he didn't want. Challenger has a helpful friend who he started to think was an enemy of his at the polls. But this much is clear. A close election comes out of a very tumultuous world situation. The German commander watched the 2 torpedoes become white spots in the Irish Sea. He knew as soon as he sent them, the ship he was targeting, pride of the British passenger line Lusitania, had about 20 minutes before it would capsize and be underwater. He also knew that he would have to leave the top of his vessel where he was watching and submerge underwater to be gone by the time anyone could spot them. Lieutenant Commander Walter Schweiker saw those 2 explosions, walls of flame, and immense clouds of black smoke. As he watched, was his sense of duty mixed with any tinge of regret? Maybe, but it's complicated. His rules allowed for 0 warning. International laws had long required an attacker to attempt to save the lives of a merchant ship's crew and the passengers before blowing it up, but submarine warfare had rendered the old laws obsolete. His information, proven correct over time, but not always publicized, certainly not in 1916, was that the ship had ammunition as well as passengers, a military target by the orders he was given. Did he regret? Maybe, like many of his countrymen, he felt a bit of resentment that British liners could operate in the Atlantic while Germany's passenger lines were stuck, in many cases, in German or American ports, or that the German Navy was bottled up by a blockade, also a violation of international law, and his U-boat represented his nation's only response to bread lines in his country. So perhaps his commander had feelings, or just felt it was war. He was right. After he fired those torpedoes, in no time, the Lusitania listed heavily to starboard. They didn't think it could happen. The Lusitania was so fast. It was 5 days into its voyage, and it was off the coast of Ireland. It was nearly home. And yet, as the wireless received words that submarines had been sighted in the area and Captain Turner ordered those lifeboats stocked and swung out, everything still happened so fast. Lookout spot a streak of white racing towards the starboard side. Their shouts of warning were instantaneous, but too late. Chaos on the deck ensued, and everyone watched as several lifeboats land bow first, and then themselves capsize to be of no use to anyone. Schweitzer was gone. His U-boat was gone. The Lusitania slips beneath the waves as he predicted about 20 minutes after its hit. The American embassy in London learns of the disaster. The first report said no lives had been lost. The ambassador's household staff carried on with the preparation for the day's big event, a dinner in honor of Wilson's friend and advisor, Colonel House, who was visiting London on a peace mission. By the time the ambassador left his desk, however, he knew that information was wrong. The death toll had exceeded 1,000. And it takes some time, but eventually they also learn that there were 128 Americans among the 1,198 victims. Among them, Alfred Gwaine Vanderbilt, going to Britain on a business trip with his valet. He had, according to witness statements, spent his last moments tying life jackets to other people and finding boats for them. When Woodrow Wilson's secretary, Joe Tumley, tries to talk to Woodrow Wilson about this news, it's coming from Ireland, the enormous scale of the tragedy, dead being buried in mass graves, no other option. Wilson could not bear to hear it. He says, Tumlety, if I were to stop and think about them, I'm afraid that when I am called upon to act, I should see red in everything. In our times, Woodrow Wilson is not a guy that gets a lot of love. He doesn't get a hug from history. It's almost like no one wants to hear about him because he's a rare figure that left and right hates. They do. Some of these beefs are legitimate. I think, for instance, there's good reason, considering where his views were on civil rights and race. Even if you nuance them a little, as I think you can, I mean, they're backwards even for his time. And we've come so far on these issues that it's almost like, why spend your time talking about a president who was so against the progress, at least unhelpful to people trying to make progress in his time. Yet there's trouble with that stance, in my opinion, is that Wilson is a president during incredible times. In fact, he'll tell Republicans that protest some of his policies that the country is different now. The whole world is different now. And he's right. Another thing to say is that left and right didn't hinge on the issue sets that they do now. That progressive conservative axis we have doesn't exactly fit in 1916. So I'm not going to rehabilitate Wilson on this two-part series, but I will say that always, as I always do on this podcast for any president, I'll save him from an unreasonable erasure from history in service to that history. And I think you got to understand his perspective as things are going on. He's elected in 1912. By any measure, he's only elected because the Republicans fight. Democrats just aren't winning presidential elections in this time. But the Republicans were torn between progressives and conservatives. This second part gets forgotten. Wilson achieves something in his own party. He unites at least the moderates and progressives. He gets the support of William Jennings Bryan, who, after he saw he couldn't win himself, supports Wilson. And being a Southerner, he gets largely the support from Southerners in the Democratic Party, an important constituency in that party. So he's a mild, progressive Southerner. I know it's difficult to see Wilson as a progressive, but this is absolutely the way that he's seen, at least in 1912. Not only does he win, but you've got a Democratic Congress and a Senate, and the opposition party is split. And you have one of the best presidential first years in terms of legislation passed. It's dizzying, the amount of legislation that's passed. Some real world-changing things. But what does that mean? When you're passing so much domestic legislation, it's almost like the same as a lot of events going on in foreign places. The country's changing. And it needed to, many felt. We were stuck in the Gilded Age, and we needed to get out of it. And arguably, you could make this argument. I've heard it made. Wilson is the president that gets you out of the Gilded Age. Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt and Taft start that process. Wilson passes the things needed to pass. What do we mean by this? He passes everything that Roosevelt and Taft couldn't do. Tariff reform. The Taft passed a weak bill. Grover Cleveland couldn't pass one. William Jennings Bryan, for all his rhetoric, couldn't get a tariff bill passed. Wilson gets it passed. He's heavily invested in it. He's more involved than any president is beforehand. He uses the president's room in Congress. He speaks to the Congress on this issue when lobby groups come in, because the tariff, keeping a high tariff, is a big concern of many businesses. He calls them out. The president might today call out different lobby groups and gets his tariff reform passed. That alone would have been a huge issue, because this is the issue of a century in American politics. I'm not saying that he totally ends that issue, but he certainly makes it less of an issue thereafter. Passes an income tax, child labor bill, Federal Trade Commission, regulation of railroads, antitrust legislation, labor legislation. Eventually, he'll get to an 8-hour workday for the one federal workforce he can control, the railroad workers. It's going to be a model for others. A federal road act to get America out of the mud. A federal farm loan program, very important to that group. And he passes a Federal Reserve, which is going to make a lot of people these days especially cringe, who don't like the Federal Reserve. I will say that the idea of a Federal Reserve was bipartisan, and where Wilson's going to add some elements that are state-based and more democratic, like the president appointing the head of the board. That's not what everybody wanted originally. Okay. Anyway, all of this change happens in like the first 2 years of Wilson's administration, when the Republicans don't have enough votes to oppose it. His Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Roosevelt's watching all this, taking notes. When he becomes president, this is going to be the act that he follows. There's a little trouble in Mexico. There's going to be more. He'll take actions both in 1913 and in 1916. It almost constitute a war, at least with certain parts of Mexico, which is having a revolution right now. It's very demanding. When his wife, Ellen Wilson, is living in New Jersey or in their house in New Hampshire, she says she feels like a soldier's wife. Woodrow Wilson is so distracted. For Wilson, he agrees the presidency to him feels fragmented, a life of infinite distraction, confusing, broken in on and thwarted in every conceivable way. I live at the beck and call of others. Many, many others. In the first 3 months of the Wilson White House, there are 41 receptions and 24,000 total guests. When he and his wife are the kind of people that don't seek out that kind of social contact. Not unable to be social, but not craving it either. Republicans, at the same time, are bitter at the defeat by Wilson. It's one thing if you get beat because voters hate you. I always felt this about Republicans towards Clinton. There's that extra venom when you're beat because you feel that your party was split. That's the only reason the guy got in there. At least that's what they think. They complain about all this legislation. It's scaring business. It's increasing unemployment. The midterm of 1914, is it confusing? Split decision about this Wilson presidency. He loses 60 seats in the House for the Democrats. They still hold on to the House, though. If he loses 60 seats, they make a few gains in the Senate. Wilson reads this midterm negatively. You know very well, he says to his aide, Colonel House, you know very well they were casting votes against me. Wilson tells him, I'm no longer fit to be president. The doctor applies the cables for the massage. Neuritis is what his doctor, Grayson, determined Wilson had, an inflammation of nerves. And at night, the doctor would apply a new-ish contraption that pumped electrical current into glass tubes and balls. A medical textbook at the time instructed doctors how to use this machine to adjust the current to produce the thickest disruptive charge from the largest ball electrode, and then apply a single, thick, thumping spark, slowly with intermissions but persistently, over the course of the affected nerve, and on each point of tenderness, until the greatest possible relief is obtained. Wilson's condition was so concerning that his Dr. Grayson moved into the White House. His wife, too, Ellen, who will live sometimes in the house in New Hampshire, moves to D.C. Ellen Wilson has been a teacher. She's very well educated. She has the precedent of Nellie Taft, who had been the previous First Lady and had been involved in some causes. She'll get involved in the plight of D.C. residents who are poor and living sometimes in hovels, and seeing that there's a slum clearance program and improved housing in Washington, D.C. She wants more than just raising money and charity, although she and her daughters will do that, and the Wilson women will be the delight of newspapers. She'll also push Congress to pass legislation, which is new. But all this activity seems to have a toll. And she faints more than once. She gets very tired. She has to rest, and she's in the room. She counters it by being even more active and pushing her causes. It's said in pushing the cause of slum clearance in D.C., she shakes hands with 3,000 people. But then she'd be confined to the room. Oh, it's the nerves, Wilson thinks. It's not a physical problem. Nothing wrong with her organically, he writes a friend. Those Axum, that was his wife's maiden name, those Axums, they have problems with their nerves. Ellen feels better and does some more. She even chides Wilson for worrying about her. This goose keeps worrying about me for no reason at all. But she's pale. People notice it's getting worse. More time in her room. And the doctor finally says this isn't just some kind of exhaustion. This isn't nerves or something psychological. It's Bright's disease. It's an inflammation of the kidneys. And there is no cure. Through the summer of 1914, Wilson will spend nights by her side. He already wasn't sleeping much as president, and he's had a stroke in the past. There's even medical experts who, looking back at descriptions, think the president had another stroke his first week in office. Never reported. All the while, he's one of the most legislatively active presidents. He'll get more done in his first year than many presidents do in 2 terms. That friendly Congress helps. He had written as a Princeton professor that the biggest problem in government was that the president wasn't active enough, and he personally seeks to change that. On tariffs, he makes 4 visits. He'll point out to congressmen, I have letters from your district supporting this legislation. I know your constituents better than you do. They don't all like that. He won't be the last president to make a statement like that to a congressman. As his wife is sick, he gets Congress to pass the Alley Dwelling Act, which provides funds to clean up the Washington district's alleys. Passing this bill puts a smile on Ellen Wilson's face. And as all of this is happening, Europe goes insane. That's the only way that it could be described from an American point of view. Europe had not had a major war since Grant was president. And that was confined to 2 countries, and it didn't last that long. Franco-Prussian War. But now, the Austrian Archduke is assassinated, Serbia is blamed, Russia mobilizes to help Serbia, Germany points that this is a declaration of war and declares war on Russia. Russia has a treaty with France. France has to honor it. Germany then invades France through Belgium. Britain tells Germany to get out of Belgium. They will not. Britain declares war on Germany. This all in a few weeks. In my view, for the effect on Wilson, it's hard to separate these two events, what's happening with his wife and what's happening in the world. The world is different. Ellen, who taught at Bryn Mawr and was advisor on all matters, Wilson would consult her. It's critical to him. He tells everyone at the White House not to say a word to Ellen about the war in Europe. It's on August 6th, 1914, when Woodrow Wilson's first wife, Ellen Wilson, dies. Just 8 days after the start of World War I. The funeral is small, services are held at the White House, only close family in attendance. Flowers do don the building, condolence telegrams from every nation in the world, visits from ambassadors. Yet as one aide describes it, Wilson is pathetic to see now. He doesn't know what to do. He simply cannot act. But he takes the train by the side of her coffin from Washington, D.C. to Rome, Georgia, the Axum family home. Whatever state he's in, he has to act. He declares a neutrality policy with all these European nations fighting. It's immediately tested. France asks for permission to get a loan from J.P. Morgan. Is that okay for a neutral nation? It's not from the government. We want it from a private company. The two belligerents try the United States in many ways. Can't Americans just stop taking British liners, the Germans ask? No, can't. That would be denying American rights. Americans are free to travel wherever they want. Well, we'll warn them in your newspapers then. Can we supply Germany? Some Texas cattle rangers, farmers, and horse traders ask. Can we supply Germany? No, because British ships will stop you and that might lead to war. Why then, the governor of Texas asked Wilson, why aren't we declaring war on Britain then? Wilson is grieving at this time. All of the elasticity has gone out of me. I read detective stories to forget, as a man would get drunk. Wilson has to make choices that no American president has made. This intense diplomacy. Cleveland got into a tussle with Britain, Harrison with Chile. That war with Spain, but it was over in a few months. These are seemingly important threats to American commerce and American citizens. He's under pressure at every turn from the party that he beat. The Republicans, Bull Moose and Stand Pat Wings, might be fighting each other, but they can agree on Wilson being an idiot, or, as Theodore Roosevelt calls him, a Byzantine logothete, a dreadful creature. Persia, the Arabic, there are a number of ships with Americans on them that are torpedoed. And each one brings a round of criticism for Wilson. But the Lusitania in 1915, first year of the war complete, is really the greatest challenge to Wilson. 128 Americans dead. The British will say, out of courtesy to Washington, they're not going to say anything now. But privately, they tell the United States that it must declare war on Germany or it's going to lose the respect of the civilized world. In Washington, when the news of the Lusitania reaches the city, it's lunchtime. A reporter intercepts William Jennings Bryan, Secretary of State in the Wilson administration. Wilson gets the news as well, cancels a round of golf, awaits news. When there's no new news, he takes a long automobile ride to try to calm his nerves. It's at 8 o'clock at night Washington time when he learns about the dimensions of the Lusitania tragedy. Shaken, he goes into the study for a few minutes. Then he goes for a long walk alone in the rain. The British ambassador cables Washington. Eventually, the British are going to signal privately, if Washington's going to turn the other cheek here, that's the way the Americans are going to handle their own citizens being slaughtered on the high seas for daring to travel, then not only are you losing honor, but you'll have no voice or influence in settling the war or what follows in the world for some time. Colonel House, Wilson's advisor, is in London at the time. And he files a brief and he urges Wilson to act soon. And this, Woodrow Wilson was of his own mind and also of the mind of a great many in America. He wasn't going to listen to the British or even his friend House on this. Wilson ignored them and nearly everyone else. And cabinet members who wanted to see Wilson were turned away. The White House made no comment on the Lusitania for more than 24 hours. And the first word, which comes from Hamilton, said only that the president keenly felt the gravity of the situation, considering very earnestly, but very calmly, the right course of action. The Eastern press in the United States was demanding retribution. German ambassador Bernstorff visits William Jennings Bryan. They think they'll get the best hearing from this member of the cabinet. They express their regret. Bryan is ambivalent about the war situation. He's pacifist, and he does tell Germany they should have signed a cooling-off treaty that he proposed. Bernstorff records this to Berlin, and it's seen as the Wilson administration maybe wants a good relationship with Germany. Wilson has to keep a long-scheduled date to address several thousand newly naturalized citizens in Philadelphia. His Secret Service agent, Jimmy Starling, could see that Wilson was uncharacteristically nervous, squirming, rocking, unable to keep his hands still. When he speaks, he says, "There is such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. There is such a thing as a nation being so right that it does not need to convince others by force that it is right. Too proud to fight would soon be a one-page headline across the country. And perhaps not the greatest one, not the greatest framing of the issue. He had used a different phrase before. There is something so much greater to do than fight. And that one didn't seem to generate criticism, but too proud to fight, Theodore Roosevelt is going to make regular statements to the press criticizing Wilson's timid nature. He has not yet begun to write, Roosevelt snarls. The symbol of patriotism is important for any incumbent if they can claim a license to it, especially in a time of crisis. And in discussing 1916, there will be a lot of talk about the war issue and the peace issue, especially R.E. Wilson, right? That's aside. But there's another battleground related to the European war and Americans' role, if it's going to have a role, and that's preparedness. It did not violate Wilson's call for neutrality in thought as well as mind. His neutrality rule that he laid down August 8, 1914. Wilson's call for neutrality could be compatible with America being prepared in some ways, just being ready to be able to defend their rights if needed. Nothing wrong with that. Wilson would point out that the Civil War was needed to save the Union. He was not engaging in any kind of pacifism. 1916 saw several large preparedness parades in major cities across the country, ostensibly dressed up as just patriotism and making awareness of preparedness, of American defensive rights and things like that. They seemed to be just general and neutral, not political, but they were organized by some Roosevelt supporters. Leonard Wood was Roosevelt's commander in the Spanish-American War and is a key political ally. He's even mentioned for president if they aren't going to nominate Roosevelt. They don't. One in New York of these parades that Wood is behind gets 100,000 people and is noted as the greatest civilian demonstration in the history of the world. But the organizers don't invite the president. Joe Tumulty gets a hold of this and he realizes what's going on here. These aren't just preparedness parades. They have a political agenda. And so when he finds that there's a Washington, D.C. parade planned, he asks the organizers, The president would like to lead the parade, can he? And of course they have to say yes. And so it's Wilson who leads the parade for Preparedness in Washington, D.C., and is featured in newspaper. Not only that, he enlarges the army to 175,000 men. He passes an officers' reserve corps. He achieves construction of battle cruisers and dreadnoughts. And he adds $50 million to the merchant marine. Now you have to understand, from the Republican point of view, these are minimal steps. But they're steps that weren't taken in the Roosevelt and Taft administration, they're going to say, because they didn't have to. Right? There wasn't a European war going on. Theodore Roosevelt's going to relentlessly attack Wilson again and again. The time of the ostrich is past. Of putting our heads in the sand as Americans is past. Opponents want it more. And Theodore Roosevelt's going to attack him as being a lot more than an ostrich in the future. Even Theodore's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, who is Wilson's assistant secretary of the Navy, does agree, he tells friends, in theory, with Theodore. He suggests that we arm and put new, big, modern guns on our ships that are in the Caribbean right now to send a message, particularly to Germany. We're worried about German militarism. This is something that's not just 1916. There's a worry about German militarism going back to the 1880s. But on Preparedness, Tumulty says, we clearly outwitted the president's enemies and took command of that issue. In terms of the preparedness, in terms of the patriotism, Americanism issue, there's one more weapon, a quiet weapon that Wilson has in his arsenal. With Alan Wilson's death, and Wilson too busy, unable at times to conduct all of the social niceties of the White House, his daughter Margaret Wilson is now the First Lady. And like her mother, she refuses to be conventional. She has a music career. Early in 1915, acting as First Lady, Margaret Wilson performed at her first public recital, a limited venue at the Baltimore Bandbox Theater. Before a supportive audience, largely friends and relatives. One critic found her rendition of Ave Maria to be an act of worship, and the word got out. Later that year, she undertook a full public concert tour. While she sought to be judged on her professional merits, it was nearly impossible for the critics to ignore the unprecedented facts that the First Lady was performing music in public. One critic offered a mixed review, stating that her voice's sympathetic quality is its most commendable attribute, a slight tremolo in the high notes, and a husky quality most noticeable in the upper and lower registers were her most serious faults. But the public profile of First Lady Margaret Wilson, daughter of the president, has its cost in 1915 and 1916. There is endless speculation about who she will marry, why she's not married. Spoiler alert, Margaret Wilson will not get married. There are rumors that she's seen with this one or that one. Woodrow complains publicly that my daughter is not a public officer as I am. Some of these people she's alleged to be engaged to, she's not even met. This doesn't stop the speculation. It's reflective of the age. I mean, there's a political and cultural battle raging as Wilson becomes president. It's going to affect the 1916 election. Some say it may have turned it. You have women, even conservative women, such as the previous First Lady Nellie Taft, asserting themselves in small ways, even if they're not to be considered feminist or suffragist particularly, getting involved in movements that are political in nature. Then the more radical, there's protesters who are being beaten by police, who are aggressively shouting at politicians or standing in the way of, or protesting in front of the White House, very vocal ways. There was an unsuccessful amendment coinciding with the 1912 election, but 12 states now allow women to vote. New York in this year, 1916, is going to consider and then reject an amendment. They'll approve one later. Both parties are straddled. In May of 1915, while continuing her public concert tour, Margaret Wilson performed at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. She sings her rendition of all stanzas of the Star-Spangled Banner and agreed to have it recorded as an album to be sold publicly. The royalties will be donated to the American Red Cross, the International Board of Relief, to purchase medical and food supplies for the increasing number of Belgian and French people being displaced. Miss Wilson has recorded this martial air with all the fervor with which it should be rendered. When we continue, both parties are going to have their conventions. Wilson's going to get a slogan that he didn't ask for, and Hughes is going to find a way to surprise the President of the United States and many on the political scene. This is part one of what I think is going to be three parts now. I want to thank you for listening. The website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. We've got a Patreon if you want to help us out and get some extra content. Thanks for listening.